Resuming debate, the Honourable Member for Beaches, East York.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm very pleased to stand in the House today and speak about Bill C-52 and to kick off today's debate. That's an act to amend the Canada Transportation Act. A word about the rail industry in Canada to set some context for this discussion of C-52. First, Mr. Speaker, rail transport is critical to Canada's economy. 70% of all surface goods in Canada are shipped by rail. Rail industry has to work for Canada. Under this government, our trade deficit is ballooning, reaching nearly $2 billion in November alone. There can be no tolerance of, because there's no room in our economy for the kinds of inefficiencies, excess costs, and performance woes that characterize our rail system presently. The problem, Mr. Speaker, is that freight rail customers are struggling to get fair and reliable services from the virtual monopoly of CP and CN that control Canada's rail system. Many rail freight customers cannot even get a contract for service from one of these companies. Those that do have to contract for unreliable services that are costing the Canadian economy hundreds of millions of dollars every year. Rotting crops, idle plants and mines, missed connections to other forms of transportation, all of this is hurting Canada's exporters, damaging our global competitiveness, and costing us jobs. These issues affect a broad range of economic activity, from agriculture, forestry, mining, and chemical, to the automotive industry. This set of circumstances is not new, Mr. Speaker. It has defined the industry for a number of years, frustrating rail freight customers so that 80% of them are now unhappy with their rail service. They have been demanding change, action from the federal government, legislation that would compel CN and CP to provide service agreements to shippers. Change has been slow in coming, however. The Rail Freight Service Review began in 2008. We had the panel, their report, a mediation exercise, another report, and then the promise of legislation from the minister. But it seems it was the private member's bill, Bill C-441 of my colleague, the NDP member for Trinity Spadina, that pushed the government at last to release this government bill that we have before us. But this is a tepid response, Mr. Speaker, to a real economic problem. It doesn't cover existing contracts. It offers only a narrow, costly arbitration process for failed negotiations for new contracts. And freight customers' demands to include penalties and service agreements, performance standards, and accessible conflict resolution were ignored. It is a start, Mr. Speaker, but much more needs to be done. And we will support the bill through to committee for amendments to redress the weaknesses and omissions in this bill. But before it gets to committee, Mr. Speaker, I think it's useful to think through more carefully and thoroughly what opportunities are lost to our economy, to us, with our rail system structured and regulated as it is presently. The current issues confronting freight customers stem from the fact that the rail industry in this country is a virtual monopoly. It was made that way in 1995 with the sale of Canadian National Railway, along with the tracks, to private interests. What was made with this sale was a virtual monopoly of a $10 billion industry that sits at the heart of the Canadian economy. Quoting from a Transport Canada document on rail transport, of total Canadian rail transport industry revenues, CN accounts for over 50% and CPR for approximately 35%. Together, CN and CPR represent more than 95% of Canada's annual rail ton kilometers, more than 75% of the industry's tracks, and 3/4 of overall tonnage carried by the rail sector. It is important, Mr. Speaker, for both our economy and our environment that our rail system run with full efficiency. The alternative to freight rail is on-road transportation by the way of truck. According to the latest Environment Canada National Inventory Report, 1990 to 2010, most transportation emissions in Canada are related to road transport. emissions from road transport rose by 37 megatons, or 38%, between 1990 and 2010. Of those 38 megatons, emissions from heavy-duty diesel vehicles or large freight trucks rose by 20 megatons, a 101% increase, Mr. Speaker. It is worth noting here that the GHG emission intensity of freight rail improved by 24% between 1990 and 2008. And it should also be noted that there remains plenty of room for improving emission intensity for both freight and passenger rail travel. Now, we know that not all truck freight is replaceable by rail freight and vice versa, Mr. Speaker, but this is a worrying trend. It's worrying not just from an environmental perspective, but it also speaks to the broader issue of congestion on our roads and the environmental and economic costs of that congestion. Clearly, the more freight that we can move by way of rail, the fewer trucks are unnecessarily using our road network for freight transport. The same obviously holds true for passenger travel. It is notable that while passenger kilometers, that is passenger travel by motor vehicle in Canada, has been on a long upward trend, passenger kilometers by train have remained virtually steady since plummeting in 1990. Of course, it was in 1990 that Via Rail lost over 45% of its ridership in the aftermath of the federal government ordering Via to abandon certain corridors and branch lines. As a result, passenger travel on Via fell from its peak of about 8 million passengers per year in the 1980s to a ridership that has bounced around the 4 million mark since. Efforts to increase rail service for passengers has been stifled by the virtual monopoly of CN and CP. Via operates its trains on 12,500 kilometers of track, but it owns a mere 2% of that. 83% of it is owned by CN and CP, with CN owning the majority of that track. The remaining track Via uses is short-line infrastructure, which is owned and maintained to reflect the freight market that these tracks serve. So with virtually no ownership of track and no priority access to track, Via Rail must negotiate train service agreements with these major freight carriers in order to provide its passenger service. And it finds itself in the unenviable position of sitting between a virtual monopoly and a succession of liberal and conservative governments who fail to recognize the enduring value and incredible economic and environmental potential of rail travel to this country. This indifference of our government to the economic and environmental potential of rail extends well beyond freight-related issues and intercity passenger travel and right into our cities. This is certainly the case in my city of Toronto, Mr. Speaker. Investment in transit infrastructure, particularly in the form of rail transit, is critical to unleashing the economic potential of Toronto's city region. Infrastructure, and transit infrastructure in particular, is a key component of a competitive business environment. This is most certainly the view of members of the Toronto Board of Trade. They identify transit infrastructure as their top priority, and their 2011 annual global benchmarking study shows why it requires urgent attention and investment. Toronto finished 19th of 24 global cities on transportation issues, including last place in commute time and significantly 16th for kilometers traveled by rail. There is near consensus that the absence of adequate transit infrastructure in Toronto and the Toronto City region is the biggest impediment to Toronto's global competitiveness. It has been estimated that the annual cost of congestion to Toronto's regional economy is $6 billion. That cost is projected to rise to $15 billion if no significant action is taken. So it is time to take significant action, Mr. Speaker. The cost of the status quo is too great and unnecessary. This, Mr. Speaker, is one of the great mysteries of this government. They continue to contradict every day their own marketing materials and brochures. They are emphatically not sound economic managers, Mr. Speaker. They stand idly as opportunities for economic growth pass them by. Bill C-52 is just the latest example of an easy fix, but also of a government that responds only when pushed and only then half-heartedly to opportunities to improve the economy of this country and the lives of Canadians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.